A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 21. It didn't end when my parents came into the room, or when the lights were turned on. While the intruders were no longer physically attacking me and I couldn't see them in my room, I could still hear the sound of the laughter outside. It sounded like someone was running in circles around my house, laughing the whole time. They knew that they'd broken me. They knew that my parents would now see me as even more crazy than before, and I would be shipped off to rot in some cold, dark nut house. My sobbing tapered off after some time, but I couldn't stop shaking. I was cold, and no matter how hard I tried to pull myself together, the shaking wouldn't go away. I was still on the floor, with my father sitting in front of me, looking over my body at the red marks that were left by the intruders. My mother was pacing back and forth across my bedroom floor, because she didn't know what else to do. "What happened to you?" my father asked, trying to sound less panicked than he was. I shook my head, but couldn't meet his eyes as I once again told him that I was fine. I'm not sure whether I thought that saying this would help my cause or if I was trying to convince myself as much as I was trying to convince them, but I can only imagine what I must have looked like to them. At one point, my father tried to take the baseball bat out of my hand, but I wouldn't let him. I clung to it and held it close to my chest, as though it provided some sort of security. I knew that it was useless, though. Everything was useless. I think my parents were talking to each other, but I don't remember what they were saying. I just remember feeling hopeless and desperate. The laughter outside wasn't loud, but it was the only thing that I could hear, and I just wanted it to stop. I wanted it all to stop. Then my father was trying to be upbeat and wanted to give me some hot chocolate to calm my nerves. He said something about a middle-of-the-night party in the kitchen, but I don't think that even he was buying into the positive spin. We were all wandering through that night, with no idea which direction to turn. We went downstairs, and my parents turned on all of the lights so that there was not one dark corner in the house. They were trying. I see that now, but back then, I don't think that I could see anything except for the pure black windows, like the world had been replaced by endless nothing. The laughter seemed closer downstairs. I couldn't believe that my parents were standing right there, yet they couldn't hear it. Part of me suspected that they did hear it, and they ignored it for the sake of making me seem even more insane. I was convinced that they wanted to get rid of me, and they had just been looking for an excuse. Well, now they had all the reason they would ever need. I hated them for hating me, and yet I still wanted to feel the comfort that I remembered feeling when they used to hold me close and keep me safe. Lucy had abandoned me. I knew that I'd told her to do it, and that she needed to do it, but I still couldn't believe that she had done it. She was the one person who had experienced what I was going through, and who could have chosen to stand by my side. But she walked away from me. She left me to be hunted. She was just like my parents. For that matter, so were my friends. They knew what was happening too, and where were they? I was angry at everyone and everything. I knew that it wasn't rational, but that didn't stop it from bubbling up inside of me. Anger was leading toward hatred, and I wanted them all to know what it was like to suffer the way I had been suffering. My grip on the baseball bat grew so tight that one of my knuckles popped. In the kitchen, my parents were going through the motions of making hot chocolate. I was watching them from my seat on the couch. I was listening to the sound of their quiet whispers, voices so low that I could just barely make out the S and T sounds. They were talking about me. They were arguing about what to do with me, where to send me, how to get rid of me. "That's not what he needs," I heard my father say. It's the only part of their conversation that I remember hearing, and I don't know what I thought he meant when he said it, but I remember feeling a surge of fear. Whatever was happening to me, my parents were going to take the situation into their own hands. They didn't even know what was happening, so how could they know how to stop it? It took me a few minutes to reach the next step in my panicked logic, but I came to realize that I was the only one who would be able to stop what was happening. If I could figure it out, I could prove to my parents that I wasn't crazy. I could stop the intruders from coming after me again. I could solve the murder of the kids in the woods. I could make everything that had happened to me over the previous few days go away, and everything could go back to the way it had been before. I needed to do it, and I needed to do it alone. The question was, where would I begin? I didn't even know what the intruders were, much less how to get rid of them. Being as tired as I was, it was difficult for me to focus my mind on the task at hand. My body was begging me to just lie down and go to sleep, but I couldn't. The intruders wouldn't let me rest for as long as they had any say in the matter, so if I ever wanted to sleep again, I needed to take care of this now. The laughing outside continued, though it might have been a little bit more distant. It had become less overt, and more like the ringing in your ears that you don't notice until you listen for it. I stared at the pitch-black windows, trying to figure out my next move. I knew that it had to be done quickly, because my parents would be back in the room soon. They would hover and pester me with endless questions that they didn't really want to hear the answers to. I had to think. I had to focus. The one thing that I knew for sure was that all of this had begun with the body that I discovered. But knowing this didn't help me much. Nobody knew who the kids were, and it would be impossible for me to track down whatever had killed them without any clues or evidence. But then, what if there was evidence? What if the people looking for that evidence just didn't know what to look for, or couldn't see it? Nobody else could hear the laughter outside. Nobody else could hear the whispers, or feel the intruders attacking them. It only made sense that whatever these things were, I had an ability to recognize them that nobody else had. It all started that day in the woods by the river. Whatever link I had to the intruders, that was the root of it. That's where the evidence would be. Lucy had warned me to stay away from the field and the woods. But what if she was wrong? What if that was exactly where I needed to go in order to end this nightmare? I understood the risk of it. Going out in the dark by myself was dangerous, even at the best of times. Going out there while the intruders were circling my house was even more so, and going out to the place where the intruders lived, if they lived at all, was quite possibly the worst move I could make. I knew this, but what choice did I have? The moment that I fully committed to that course of action, I felt something inside of me click into place. In my mind, I knew that I could be very wrong, but there was some other place inside of me where this decision felt good and right. For the first time since any of this started, I felt as though there was an easy path forward, and by going down that path, I might find the peace that I so desperately needed. In the kitchen, my parents were now hunched over my father's laptop, still whispering things to each other. They were talking about me and arguing about me, but they had barely even looked at me since we'd come down the stairs. Slipping out of the house wasn't hard. I just walked to the front door and opened it as slowly and quietly as possible. The air outside was thick and muggy and smelled like something rotting nearby. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. At first, I walked away from the house as though someone might hear me and come running, but as I moved farther away, I stopped caring. I walked faster and faster, and eventually started to run. There was no more laughing in the distance. I didn't know where the intruders were, but I neither heard nor saw any sign of them as I made my way down the driveway. I felt alone, and that comforted me. There were no enemies or traitors. It was just me, and I was finally taking charge of my own fate. I ran faster down the driveway and onto the street. At some point, I realized that I was in bare feet, but it didn't slow me down at all. I couldn't go back home for shoes. I didn't know if I'd ever go back home at all. And it didn't matter to me. Nothing mattered, except getting to the field and finding the key to all of this. "Dale!" came the sound of my father's voice, so distant that he might as well have been one of the intruders laughing at me. They knew that I was gone, and they would come after me. My father would get into his car and drive down the street, but it wouldn't help him. I always used a shortcut to get to the woods. He would never see me in the dark. He would never be able to stop me from finding my way out there. Adrenaline was surging through my entire body, but for the first time in days, it wasn't because I was terrified. I was exhilarated. I was free, and each step that I took toward the woods made that feeling grow just a little bit more. It was intoxicating. My head was spinning, and I felt almost disconnected from my body. Nothing was real. This part of my memory feels like the memory of a movie because I can see myself running through the grass, still gripping that stupid baseball bat, but I see it from outside of my own body. I ran past a tree, not seeing one of its low-hanging branches in the darkness. The branch scratched the side of my face, but it didn't slow me down. Nothing could slow me down, because I knew where I had to be. "Dale!" I heard my father call again, but it didn't sound like my father, and I didn't feel like Dale anymore. The closer to the woods I got, the lighter I felt, and by the time I reached its outer edges, I was almost flying. I wanted to be there, and I could feel the whole area wrapping itself around me like a warm blanket. It was comforting, and I needed that comfort more than anything. I'm not sure that I even remembered why I had gone out there. It didn't matter. The deeper I moved into the field, the more peace came over me. "Dale!" The word meant nothing to me. The voice meant nothing. A yellow glow came over the field, breaking through the beautiful blackness. Grass and trees had color to them once again, but it was wrong. It was ugly. I heard the sound of a car door slamming, but I kept running. I needed to make it into the woods. I could sleep in the woods. I don't remember being aware of my father running to catch up to me. I just remember feeling the weight of him on top of me as we both fell to the ground. I remember screaming and kicking and trying to swing the baseball bat, but my arms were pinned to my side. The screams that I hear in my memory did come from me, but it doesn't feel like the memory of something that I did. When I hear those screams in my nightmares, they don't sound like me. "Let me go," I screamed into my father's face, over and over again, but he didn't release me. At first, he didn't even respond to me. He just held me there, content to stop me from moving. Then I remember hearing him tell me that I was all right, but I kept screaming and fighting to get free. He didn't understand. I needed to be out there. I needed to get to the woods because the woods had the answers. I needed the answers because nobody else would find them. Still pinning my arms to my side, my father pulled me close and held me against his chest. My legs were still kicking and I was trying to break free of him, but it was as though he didn't even notice my efforts. He just held me there for I don't know how long. This part of my memory is back inside of myself, looking through my eyes and feeling the sting of cuts on my face and feet. I remember the sound of my father breathing close to my ear. Then I remember him saying, "We're leaving," as much to himself as it was to me. I was still struggling against him as he stood up and pulled me along with him. I was still reaching out, desperate to get to the trees, screaming for him to let me go. I was convinced that he didn't understand it. I was convinced that if I could just get out there, I could make them all see what I saw. When we got to the van, my father put me in the back seat and used the child safety locks to keep me in. He got into the driver's seat, and I started to kick at the door trying to get out, but I couldn't. Then I turned on him, hitting him repeatedly as he drove the van away from the field and down the street. He did his best to avoid those hits, but I still managed to do some damage. When we got to the house, my mother was waiting by the door. She had bags packed, and my parents threw them into the back of the van. I couldn't scream or fight anymore. My chest grew so tight that I felt as though I were suffocating. I clawed at the back seat and the doors in the back of my parents' seats, trying to get someone to please help me, but my father just kept driving. My mother looked back at me, with hands over her mouth and tears streaming down her face. She reached a hand back to me, but I swatted it away. I didn't want her. I didn't want either of them. I just wanted the woods and some peace at last. As we drove on, I could feel the woods growing farther away, and it felt as though something was being ripped out of my body. I collapsed onto the seat, struggling to breathe, but I couldn't take a breath without a sharp pain in my gut forcing me to stop. Shallow breaths were all I had as we drove on, out of Huxley and away from everything I ever knew. However, after some time, and despite the pain inside of me, I did notice that there was no laughing outside the window. Instead, the van fell into total silence, save for the sound of my shallow breaths. Farther away still, and the stabbing in my gut turned into a jagged churning. My father pulled into the parking lot of a gas station, and he came to the back seat to check on me. I don't remember everything that was said, but I do remember him walking me to the side of the building, and I remember throwing up in the shadows. He gave me something for my stomach, and then we drove on, away from Huxley, and into a whole new life. This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.